To Build a Home by hottchocolatte. Read by Guardian of the Loaf. Chapter 1. Warnings include panic attacks and PTSD. I can't believe it's been 5 years already. Time goes so fast. Izuku smiled, brilliant white teeth on display. Shoto gave him a lovesick grin in return. I know. It's been the happiest 5 years of my life. He stretched his warm hand across the velvet table cover, wrapping it around his husband's, their matching wedding bands shining in the candlelight. Shoto Todoroki was a hopeless romantic, never hesitating to spend thousands on Izuku if it meant that they could have a single night to themselves in Tokyo's finest 5-star restaurant. Izuku didn't mind, especially when he got to see his husband in a silky navy suit that complimented his eyes and hugged him in all the right places. A soft pink tie peeked through the sea of blue, accentuating the stark contrast of a dual-colored ponytail that flowed down his right shoulder. Izuku took the hand that wasn't holding Shoto's and fussed with the sleeves of his own cream-colored suit. His gaze met a stormy sea, making contact with his soul, and he felt an overwhelming warmth flood his chest. It gave him a little bit more confidence for the suggestion he was about to make. The low light of the vacant restaurant illuminated Shoto's features, the soft smile teasing his lips, tension from work and daily life leaving with every stroke of Izuku's thumb on his hand. Izuku imagined spending 5 more years with him, and 5 after that, and after that. He imagined staying by Shoto's side through every trouble imaginable. He imagined countless nights like this, just the two of them, soaking in each other's energy and love. He imagined adding someone to their love. He imagined how fatherhood would look on Shoto, how he would pour all of his love and care into a child that was theirs. He imagined how perfect this man would be, and Izuku's being was overwhelmed with pouring affection for his husband. Shoto's face twisted in worry, gripping his hand tighter. Izuku, what's wrong? You're crying. Sure enough, familiar streaks of saline dripped down Izuku's face, making Izuku realize that he got lost in his head again. Dwelling on their future always left him overly emotional, and his planned question burned a hole in the forefront of his mind. He shook his head, wiping his eyes with his free hand. Nothing is wrong, He sniffed, bringing his free hand to join the one holding Shoto's, rubbing soothing circles with both. I love you so much, Shoto. His husband's features melted, already used to Izuku's wide emotional spectrum. And I love you. Toned sincere and deep, Shoto brought his free hand to join Izuku's, clasping them together, grounding them both in each other's presence. Izuku hesitated. They had talked about the subject before they got married. Shoto didn't have any negative reaction to it, but he wasn't too ecstatic either. They agreed to wait until they were stable enough in their hero work. The subject wasn't brought up again, but it wasn't untouchable. Izuku only hoped that Shoto was still willing to give it a chance. Izuku looked away, and Shoto remained patient, letting Izuku build enough courage and words to say what he wanted to. Izuku sighed, chest ready to burst, and he set his shoulders. He stared back into Shoto's eyes, determined to go through with this plan. What would you say if... He gripped Shoto's hands tighter, feeling the temperature contrast, letting it ground him. If we adopted a child. Shoto's reaction was shocked, then it melted into something thoughtful. Izuku took it as a sign to continue. Our careers are set. We have the funds. I know adopting is complicated, but with our statuses it should go more smoothly. We'd have to move, though. Our apartment doesn't have the room for an extra person, but there are a couple homes closer to our agency we can look at. It would be hard being around with both of us being in the top 10, but we could have some of our friends babysit and we can take shifts. Or we could take alternating shifts so at least one of us will be with them. I know you didn't really want to bring adoption up much before, but I figured... Izuku kept rambling, hands nervously rubbing Shoto's as he continued to work himself into a panic, looking at the table to avoid his husband's eyes. Who is he kidding? It was too soon. He should have waited and not ruined one of their only nights off for something Shoto wouldn't even be interested in. Shoto already had hesitancy even approaching the subject, so it was stupid of Izuku to push it on him so suddenly. Izuku was almost ready to start taking everything about the suggestion back when Shoto suddenly cupped his cheek with a cold hand, forcing his head up to look at the soft, heterochromatic gaze. Izuku. Shoto's voice was so soft, so loving, a gentle smile on his lips as he spoke his name. Izuku sniffed, rambling coming to a halt as he melted under the icy touch, leaning into it. Shoto rubbed his thumb across a freckled cheek, murmuring low but no less sincere. If it makes you happy, Izuku, I have no issues with adopting and adding another member to our family. Izuku's smile dropped, frowning at his husband. Shoto, we talked about this. You know I can't deny you anything, he smirked, thumb trying to coax Izuku's frown away. Izuku huffed, blushing at the implications of that statement. It was true. Shoto never denied Izuku of anything. As sweet as it was, in hindsight, it would have become very dangerous if Izuku was not as disciplined and understanding of Shoto as he was. They had a few fights over the matter, Izuku bringing up the fact that he could go over a boundary of Shoto's and Shoto not saying anything to please Izuku. Izuku never wanted to take advantage of Shoto. Ever. They had talked extensively about the subject even before their marriage, and Shoto was still working on telling Izuku his true feelings on something Izuku insisted on. Izuku didn't want Shoto to settle with whatever made Izuku happy. He wanted Shoto to be excited and wanting of it for himself, too. Otherwise, Izuku wasn't going to let it happen. Izuku sighed, bringing a hand up to hold the cold one on his cheek. I don't want you to just decide based on what I want. I want you to be happy with it, too. Adopting is a huge thing. We'd be raising a child, and I want it to be a thing we want together. As much as I want to, I'm not going to bring it up anymore if we are not on the same page here. I want us to be together on this or not at all. They stared at each other, unmoving, until Shoto sighed and pulled both of his hands back to fold them together on the table. He stared at a spot on the tablecloth, fingers working in a telling sign of anxiety. I have had my insecurities on the matter of children. Izuku waited, letting him gather his thoughts and feelings, his own hands coming down to grip his pants legs. Shoto took a deep breath, looking up at Izuku through his dull-colored bangs. I want to have children. I do. It's not just me giving in to you. He reached his warm hand across the table again, and Izuku clasped onto this seeping warmth as he listened. I've thought about what it would be like to raise a child with you, extensively. I apologize for not showing my intentions about adopting sooner, but there have been some things about myself that I have been unsure about. Shoto was cut off by Izuku withdrawing his hand and the sound of a chair scraping carpet. Izuku stood up abruptly to round the table and take Shoto's cheeks in his scarred hands, locking their lips firmly, tears still streaming down his face. They stayed like that for several seconds, drinking each other in, when they had to part for air. Izuku rested his forehead against Shoto's, whispering softly, I love you so much. I think you're going to be an amazing father, Shoto. Shoto smiled wide, a rare show of perfect teeth and tears beginning to spill over in a cacophony of beauty that left Izuku breathless as he was pulled down for another searing kiss. They breathed on each other, satisfied in themselves for the rest of the night at the prospect of expanding their love, knowing that there were many trials ahead. They would get through it. Together. Shoto was conflicted. The morning sun filtered through the window of their kitchenette, illuminating the area and creating a glow that should have settled his heart like it had for the past 5 years. It didn't, though, not when his mind was whispering his deepest insecurities and doubts. He'd been sleeping fitfully ever since he had agreed with adopting, and he was exhausted. His nerves and anxiety crept up in a gradual swell of doubt and uncertainty. He stirred the eggs on the stove with a little more force than necessary, trying to focus on the task of making breakfast before Izuku came back from his morning run, but failing as his mind conjured memories and horrors of the past. He wanted to raise a child with Izuku. He wanted to see Izuku as a father. He knew without a doubt that he would do a wonderful job, his gentle nature shining through every day as the #1 hero. Shoto wanted to build their family, build a home for 3. He wanted it so bad that he often wondered why they hadn't adopted sooner. Then the creeping fear and trauma resurfaced, reminding Shoto of him. He didn't want to turn into him. He wouldn't. However, that didn't stop him from fearing the worst and imagining all the horrible things that could go wrong, all the things that had gone wrong. He plated the eggs, covering them in foil so they wouldn't cool too fast. He checked on the rice, seeing that it was about 5 minutes from being done, and began to set the small table just outside the kitchenette. Shoto adjusted it to perfection, lining each setting up systematically with each other. Once he was done, he stepped back, trying to figure out what else he could do, but came up empty after the rice cooker set off, signaling its completion. All that was left was for his husband to return, which would be another 10 minutes if he was moving according to their usual schedule. Shoto leaned back into the counter, closing his eyes and folding his arms as he tried to slow his breathing. He hadn't realized he was getting so worked up until he stopped, the whispers in his head growing louder the more he gave them attention. He was so tired. He feigned sleep when Izuku had gotten up at 5 a.m. to start his daily workout, letting Izuku kiss him and bound out the door. If Shoto could hardly sleep past his thoughts with Izuku pressed against him, he definitely wouldn't without him. Hence, Shoto being up an hour earlier than he normally would, doing random chores and laundry before he had to start breakfast. Now that everything was done, all the stress of his current work case and the past few days of agonizing over this adoption was starting to bubble over. They were both pro-heroes. It was so easy for one of them to die in the line of duty. He didn't want to leave a child parentless just when they had given them hope. They were both top 10 pro-heroes, too. What if they weren't home enough for the child? What if they incidentally neglected their child? They had talked about it while they were both researching different adoption agencies just yesterday. Yet Shoto couldn't think past the what-ifs that had been plaguing him since their anniversary. He stared at his left hand. He'd grown scarily proficient with his quirk since high school. But what if he accidentally hurt their child? Hurt Izuku? Then he'd be a repeat of him. He'd hate himself so much more than he already did. Izuku would probably hate him too, never wanting to see Shoto again. He could live with that if it meant that he wouldn't ruin their lives, just like... Something screamed. Shoto jumped, breath picking up, a memory resurfacing unbidden amongst the torrent of emotion. He whipped around to see the rice cooker, steam steaming out of the slits in the top furiously. He'd neglected to let it cool, apparently. He unlocked the clasp, throwing the lid across the counter, making it skid across the granite. The screaming stopped, and Shoto was staring at steaming rice, chest heaving and sweat dripping. It wasn't the same. The kettle sounded different. It wasn't the same. It didn't matter. He struggled to breathe, his left hand coming up to grip the fabric at his chest, the other barely holding him against the counter. His mother, eyes wide and scared. His father, what he'd done to make her hurt him. He wasn't him. He didn't want to be him. He couldn't be him. His scar burned, a phantom pain of the horror so long ago, the trauma everlasting. He smelled smoke, wisps of gray floating across his vision. He yanked his left hand away from his shirt, looking down to see a hole in the gray material, flames licking the edges. Shoto couldn't breathe. The shirt was yanked off, arms frantically throwing it across the room, the fabric still smoking despite the cause of the fire gone. Shoto stared at his hand, the flames licking his fingertips as he struggled to breathe again. He was suddenly on the floor, butt colliding with harsh tile, but he couldn't care about the pain when he kept seeing visions of his father hurting his family, hurting their child, hurting Izuku. I'm not him. His legs kicked, pushing him violently against the wood of cabinets, still trying to breathe. He vaguely registered flames still licking the pile of fabric across from him, and he threw his right arm out in reflex. Shoto heard more than saw the ice crystallizing in front of him, but he couldn't care less about collateral when he was suffocating. He choked on the realization that he couldn't control his quirk right now. What if he was too broken and this happened again? He'd hurt them. He'd be just like his father. He'd hurt their child. He'd hurt Izuku. He couldn't. Shoto couldn't hear the door open, nor the footsteps over the blood rushing in his ears. Odo? That child's left side is unsightly. He gasped, gripping his hair with a cold hand, the other as far from him as he could make it. The visions and memories danced across his vision, mashing together in a montage of horror that left him choking. It was all too real. It was all too much. Shoto! That sounded different. It was hard to tell with the multitude of voices floating around his brain, but the panicked shout felt like a knife trying to cut through the haze. He sputtered, chest constricting the more he struggled. The voice cut through again, louder than before. I need you to listen to me. He recognized that voice. It was more real than the others, more there. It was the only one that wasn't terrifying, so he followed it, latching on to the strand of reality. He's only 5. Shoto. He still couldn't breathe, the haze in his mind clouding his every sense as he struggled to focus on the familiar voice calling him. He's already 5. He whined, the noise foreign and odd in his ears, but he couldn't care when it was hard to do anything. Is the number that comes when I think of all the years I want to be with you." Was someone singing? His father never sang. His mother did occasionally when she wouldn't be heard, but no one. Precisely what I planned to do. It was distracting. It was odd. No one sang, much less in what sounded like English. "I get my money right, buy you everything, and show you all the finer things." It wasn't even that good. The English was decent and the tone was horrible, but it seemed to be distracting him enough to the point where it was the only thing he could hear. Shoto's breath still stuttered brokenly, but the haze was thinning and the blood rushing was quieting. The melody cutting through his mind like a ray of light. "There ain't no need to rush." His scalp suddenly hurt for where he'd tugged on his hair, and his tailbone was sore from failing. He brought both of his hands to his chest, curling up within himself as he focused on the voice, trying to coax his lungs back to normal. "Will you marry me? I swear that I will mean it." "Wait, Izuku?" "I'll say, will you marry me?" The voice switched to humming, apparently reaching a break in the song. He glanced up, seeing his husband between a mess of dull-colored hair. Izuku had obviously just come back from training, his t-shirt sticking to his chest with sweat, beads of it rolling down his face. His face was flushed, freckles highlighted by the glow of the morning sun. Izuku was crouched down in front of Shoto, face pulled taut with worry as he continued to hum softly, pulling Shoto further out of his panic with each broken note. They locked eyes, and Izuku's face softened in relief. Shoto was about to protest when he stopped humming, but it was forgotten when Izuku spoke lowly. "Hey, baby, you with me?" Shoto could only nod, chest hitching with each breath. His mind tried to slip back into the haze, but Izuku wasn't going to let it. "I'm going to keep singing for you, is that okay?" Shoto nodded again. He didn't want him to leave. Izuku smiled, soft and understanding. He stayed crouched to the floor, moving to sit more comfortably with his legs crossed. How many people in the world can make me feel like this? Scarred hands tapped the floor in semblance of a beat, and Shoto focused on the stuttered movement. "Baby, I don't ever plan to find out. The more I look, the more reasons I find why." Izuku's voice was off-key but calm, and Shoto couldn't think about anything else but his husband's melody. "You're the love of my life." Shoto brought his left hand up to his face, and realized he was crying when he felt wetness as he ran it over his scar. "You know, one of these days, when I get my money right." He sniffed, nausea swelling in his gut as he felt the ridges and bumps over and around his eye. "Buy you everything and show you all the finer things in life." His chest hitched, but he wasn't choking anymore. He could breathe. "Will forever be enough, so there ain't no need to rush?" Tears dripped down his chin in a constant stream and landed on his chest, the water steaming instantly on his right side. He gritted his teeth. "But one day, I won't be able to ask you loud enough." Izuku stayed in the same place, fingers tapping and gaze soft and solid, a constant pillar of support that kept Shoto focused on reality. "I'll say, will you marry me?" Shoto hiccuped, scrubbing his face with his right hand as his left came down to lay on the floor. "I swear that I will mean it." Izuku's voice got softer and slowed, seeing that Shoto was coming back to himself. "I'll say, will." Shoto uncurled, face still wet, as he scooted himself closer to Izuku. He needed "you." Izuku noticed immediately, scooting across the floor to meet him. "Mary?" He refrained from touch, hands hovering in the air, unsure if Shoto wanted to stay close or... Shoto cleared it up by throwing himself at Izuku, gripping his damp shirt and heaving a sob in his husband's chest. "Me." Izuku held him as he cried. Harsh sobs racked through Shoto's body, all the anguish of reliving memories and the stress of current situations finally breaking free. Izuku whispered nonsense into the tangle of red and white, keeping Shoto grounded. Shoto wanted to apologize. He wanted to tell Izuku how much he loved him. He wanted to scream how messed up his head was. But all he could do was cry, knowing that they would talk and Izuku would tear every doubt he had about himself into the ground. They would work through it. Together. "You haven't been sleeping well." Shoto didn't respond. Izuku didn't expect him to. Izuku settled a mug of chamomile tea in front of his husband, who let the steam hit his face, eyes glued to the table. "I'm sorry for letting it get this far. I thought talking about it would be enough, but..." Shoto's cracked voice trailed off, eyes never leaving the scalding mug. Izuku sighed. If he was being honest, he thought Shoto was fine too. Big mistake, given that he walked in on his husband having a panic attack in the middle of their kitchenette. He felt like a shitty husband. No, Izuku turned, keeping his voice soft as he picked up his own mug of tea. I am the one who is sorry, Shoto. He turned back around to see his husband finally looking at him, confusion written across his puffy face. Why, I pushed you. They both fell silent, eyes returning to their respective mugs. Izuku took a deep breath, voice lowering to a whisper that silence carried perfectly. I pushed you when you weren't ready. I didn't pay enough attention. A slam startled Izuku, making him look up to his husband. Shoto's right fist was frosted slightly, clenched against the countertop, sloshes of tea cooling rapidly with the temperature difference. Don't! Shoto's voice was raw and desperate, and Izuku's heart broke for the second time that morning. Don't you dare say that this is your fault. Shoto looked up, locking eyes with him, tears dripping from his chin. It is not your fault that my head is fucked up. It is not your fault that I could hurt you. Shoto returned his gaze back to his slightly spilled teacup, his hair hiding his expression from Izuku's view. He sniffed, relaxing his tensed fist in exhaustion. It is not your fault that I could hurt our child. Oh, Shoto. Izuku's heart was torn out, crumbled to dust. He couldn't fathom Shoto, the kindest man he's ever met, hurting something so precious. It was a valid concern, but Shoto was not his father. Oh, baby. Izuku set his mug down as he rounded the corner to hold his husband's trembling form. Shoto turned in his chair, opening himself for Izuku's arms. They met, and Shoto melted into his husband's embrace, hiccuping as he tried to bring himself under some semblance of control. Izuku stroked his husband's dull-colored ear, scratching his scalp and whispering soft murmurs in his ear. They stayed there for several minutes, keeping each other from breaking further. Izuku waited until his husband stopped shaking to pull back slightly and lift Shoto's chin so they locked eyes. Izuku's chest clenched at his husband's wrecked face, and used his free hand to wipe away the tear tracks. Shoto let Izuku handle him, becoming putty and scarred hands. Izuku leaned down so their lips met for several soothing seconds, then pulled away to rest their foreheads together. You are not your father, Shoto. The words were spoken in a whisper, and Shoto's face twisted in an internal pain. But, no. Izuku pulled both of his palms to frame Shoto's face, keeping their eyes locked and foreheads together in a desperate plea for him to see what Izuku was trying to say. You are, never were, and never will be your father. Shoto's breath hitched. Izuku kept going. I know you. You would never hurt something so precious. You are not that kind of man, and you never will be. Izuku's voice began to shake, his own emotions going wild with how much love he had for this man, how much he was willing to do and say to get him to see how worthy he was. Shoto placed his hands over Izuku's, warming and cooling his shaking. Please, please believe me, Shoto. You are so, so kind, so wonderful, so loving. Izuku's voice finally broke, his own tears streaming with how much emotion he was emitting. He buried his face into Shoto's neck, both of their arms wrapped around the other. Izuku eventually calmed, pulling away and sitting on the floor where Shoto slid down from his chair to join him. Emerald stared at a storm, and Shoto chuckled. This is the second time I've been on the floor this morning. Eyes widened in partial shock, lips quirked up in a smile. Izuku huffed. Yeah, same here. Shoto stared at Izuku for a moment, before his eyes widened almost comically. Izuku's brows pinched, wondering what was wrong. What time is it? Shoto stood up abruptly, frantically searching for something. Izuku stayed on the floor, the situation finally clicking. Izuku huffed and laughed. Oh yeah, Shit! Shoto scrambled to open his newly found phone, apparently having seen the time displayed on the opening screen. We're late! Shoto! His husband whipped around, eyes in a panic, but much clearer than before. What? Izuku hadn't moved, watching his husband's frenzy with barely concealed amusement. Barely, as in he burst out in uncontrolled giggles at Shoto's wild hair and frenzied expression once he turned around. He clutched his stomach, falling back on the tile as Shoto watched in bewilderment. After a minute of watching his husband failing to control his sudden laughter, Shoto walked over to Izuku, standing over him with arms crossed in a deadpan expression. Izuku suddenly reached up, startling Shoto, then promptly pulled his husband down on top of himself. Shoto shot his arms out, framing Izuku's head, their noses nearly touching. Izuku was still giggling, and Shoto fought a smile. What's so funny, Izuku? Red and white locks brushed across freckled cheeks, and Izuku gasped, finally beginning to calm down. Shoto blew a puff of air in Izuku's face, making him blink rapidly, which set Shoto in a low chuckle. The green-it finally had enough breath to speak, winding his arms around the man on top of him. We don't work today. Izuku's smile was blinding, but Shoto was confused. What? But I thought... the case... Nope. Izuku brought a hand up to mess up Shoto's hair even further. Ida and Momo are visiting our part of Tokyo, so they're going to help us out today. We technically do still have work. The case files will be emailed to us later today, but I had plans to take us house hunting. Izuku then trailed off, his smile sinking as he remembered the last 2 hours. Shoto suddenly flipped them over, and it was Izuku's turn to frame his husband's face with his arms. Their foreheads touched, and Izuku continued. Shoto, I meant what I said. I'll do whatever I possibly can to make you believe it. The green-eyed threaded scarred hands through dual-colored locks. I want you to be comfortable with this adoption. I want you to be happy. Please tell me if you don't want... Izuku was cut off with warm lips on his, and a cold hand through his hair. He pulled back for air and was met with the stormy sea he had been married to for the past 5 years, and loved for much longer. I am happy. You make me happy. I want this, believe me, Izuku. Shoto switched their positions once again, rolling Izuku off of him to regain his place on top. Izuku giggled as Shoto's hair tickled across his face. Red and white curtained and consumed Izuku's whole view of the outside world, Shoto being his one and only focus as he stared into his husband's eyes for any hint of discomfort or uncertainty, not wanting Shoto to push himself too far for the day. He found nothing but love and unwavering excitement in Shoto's expression, and Izuku felt a smile creep up on his lips. A soft thing, not like the blinding ones he was used to giving so freely, but one that a rare few have seen. Heart finally settled and at ease, Izuku willingly poured his entire heart and soul into pulling Shoto down slowly into another kiss, lavishing all his unspoken assurances and praises into him as they drank in each other. They parted, slowly, breathing in and relishing the feelings and settling in a comfortable silence as they took their time getting off the kitchen tiles. There were still several things they needed to work through. Izuku needed to make sure Shoto would be okay, and that he wasn't being too overbearing with future plans. But the kisses and playful teasing that they exchanged while shuffling into their much-needed shower gave Izuku the hope and reassurances that they would truly be okay. They would be okay. Together.